Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome again to this ShareCafe webinar. My name is Tim McGowan. We have our largest audience online ever today, so thank you all for your time. It's probably got a lot to do with the quality of the companies that are presenting and their fantastic share price returns over the last 12 months. We've got 10-minute presentations, 5 minutes for Q&A, if time permits. If not, we'll follow up with the companies later on. First up today, we have Split It Payments, ASX code SPT, which has a market cap of 500 million, which is up 150% since last week. Split It is a member of the buy now, pay later industry. It's a company floated in January 2019. So the share price that was during the Corona crash lows of around 22 cents, it's back up to $1.32 now, and has drawn comparisons with the sector superstar in Afterpay. So why is Split It different to other buy now, pay later companies like Afterpay and Zip? Let's find out. We have with us this morning Split It CEO Brad Patterson, who is live from San Francisco. Over to you. Thank you, Brad.
Thank you for having me. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, all my friends and fellows in Sydney. It's Melbourne and all over Australia, or wherever you are in the world. It's great to be here. It's fantastic to be on the ShareCafe for my first time and to talk to you all about Split It and what's been happening of late. So let's jump in if we move along. What is Split It? For those of you that are not as familiar, we are the only global installment payment option that enables consumers to use their existing credit on their credit cards to pay in installments at checkout. That dramatically increases and improves card abandonment or improves card conversion for merchants. So we're solving for both sides of the network. What's been happening recently? A couple of very big highlights, which I'll talk to you about as we go through the presentation. We saw a significant uptick in merchant sales volume in April and May, with May recording a 321% growth in our merchant sales volume, really on the back of us executing a strategy that we refreshed late last year and benefiting from the shift to e-commerce on the back of the global pandemic. We've seen our average order value increase significantly as well with the shift to the new strategy. And we're playing in a space where we believe that we operate relatively alone and providing a service that only we can, given the industry that we've chosen. And I'll talk a little bit about that shortly. And finally, the big news from last week, on top of some previous news, we just announced a partnership with a global payments company, Mastercard, on the back of a partnership with Visa in March and Stripe in January. So this is really about building our foundations, which enable us to scale and grow for the next 5, 10, and 20 years. So let's look at where we play. We move along. You can see up and to the right, we believe we operate in a quadrant that is uncrowded and nobody else is. To the bottom left, you can see players that are issuing new debt or new financing to consumers at the point of sale for purchases, and for smaller ticket sizes, around 100 to between $100 and $200. Up and to the top right, we're playing in a space where consumers are not issued new debt. They're using the existing debt they have or finance they have on a credit card, and we're focusing on larger ticket items. Average order values for us are around $800 plus. We see a sweet spot around $300. Why is that compelling to merchants? There are over 1.8 billion, nearly 2 billion credit cards, Visa, Mastercards in the world today. 70% of the credit on those cards typically is not utilized. And while that may reduce recently given the current times, it's still significant. There's no application for consumers. As you'll see, they enter their credit card and choose the installment numbers, and that's it. We talked about the higher average order value. It's a lower default risk than you see in other options, given that we're using a customer's credit card limit today. And it's complementary. We often see that we sit by all of our friends that are sitting down in the other parts of the quadrant, given we play in a different space. So this is really a matter of us for now continuing to build the foundations and execute. What does this look like for a consumer? You can see here they choose there's really 3 screens. It's frictionless, and this is why we deliver massive benefit to the merchants and consumers we serve. Customers choose to pay with Split It, choose a number of installments, and check out the same way they do today. 3 schemes, sometimes 2, and they're done. That's it. No account, no application. We check the credit card. We put a hold, in most cases, on the amount, and then off we go. Moving along, what does that turn into in results? You can see merchant sales volume in April and May started to really take off. What was driving that? Three things have really driven that. We have seen an increase in merchant sales volume from new merchants onboarded in Q1 of this year. I'll talk about some of those merchants shortly. Secondly, there's been a big shift to e-commerce. Which we know, we've seen nearly the addressable market triple in e-commerce in recent months. We believe that structural change in how people shop is here to stay. They're shopping on their phones and in e-commerce and staying away from in-store. This is playing nicely into where we've decided to focus, which is just e-commerce. Finally, something the pandemic has really driven the uplift in is improving consumer preference. We have an NPS in the high 60s. We see consumers preferring our option where they can use their existing credit card for higher ticket items, which turns a $1,200 bicycle over 12 months into a $100 payment next month. They can do that on their existing credit card, but because there's no account application, it's frictionless, and we're seeing preference really take off, leading to share of checkout items that some of our customers have published, which is much higher than we have seen before. Average order value has also bounced back. It had dropped early in March and February during the pandemic. We've seen that bounce back up, now well above $800 to $900. So consumers are back spending the same amount. They're doing that over about 6 installments. You can see a number of new large merchants with improved preferences driving volume. We can't do this alone. We do this with partners. And part of our strategy has been building our foundations is to partner with key critical global players in the global payments ecosystem. We're very, very thrilled and excited to announce a partnership with Mastercard last week. I've been asked a lot, what does that mean? That really means 3 things. Firstly, it means that we're going to accelerate split acceptance in partnership with Mastercard. We will integrate with the Mastercard payment gateway service, which serves other gateways and merchants around the world. Jointly, we will be offering Split It to their customers as part of accelerating the acceptance of installments on cards around the world. We see this as a significant opportunity for us to broaden our reach and broaden our acceptance in the months and years to come. We'll drive innovation. We'll be jointly developing new products in the installment space, which could open up a number of new opportunities across a number of different customer types and countries. Which brings me to a global rollout. This is a global partnership. We'll focus on the UK, Canada, and Australia to start with, and we'll expand that quickly as we start to see the best way for this partnership to work. It's a 5-year partnership. We're incredibly excited about the opportunity to work with one of the most innovative and leading payments players around the world. If we move along, as you will see, this is in addition to down the bottom partnerships that we signed in March with Visa, which is really focused on the innovation in the global space, which will then lead to accelerating usage for consumers and merchants. And with Stripe, a partner in the back end, which allows us to scale rapidly. We have a small number of merchants, below 1,000 at the moment, because that is quite manual for consumers to onboard onto our platform. Currently, it can take weeks, sometimes over 4 weeks to onboard to our platform. Our vision, and this is the beginning of this, and starting in Q3, you'll start to see us rolling out where it can take customers in a much shorter time to onboard onto our platform. We expect that the customers will be able to onboard, just like they can with PayPal, onto our platform within minutes, not weeks. That's a vision we have for later this year, early next year, and we'll start implementing that in Q3 after we've actually rolled out a number of the work. We just completed the integration with Stripe these last couple of weeks. Merchants, we've had a great quarter. Just to touch on some of those merchants, some of the largest merchants that you will see in the e-commerce space have added us in some of those industries, but we're just getting started. What does the future look like? We're experiencing record growth. We've never seen growth like this. We believe this is a result of our strategy. We've shifted our strategy to be focused on those merchant verticals and those average order values that we intended to focus on. And it will take time for that to ramp up. And this is the beginning. This is the beginning of you starting to see that take off. Consumer awareness is growing. I spoke about that before. Merchant demand will increase. We have seen an increase in demand for installments, as I'm sure all of our friends have in the industry. We're seeing a real increased demand as people become aware of us. So partnerships that you saw last week really raises awareness for us as well. And the demand inbound is at record levels that we haven't experienced before, which is fantastic news. We'll continue to focus on large merchant acquisition. We'll continue to focus on merchants that fit our profile that we can help best. We'll focus on serving them the best we can to deliver a significant benefit to them And in time, that will spread and accelerate into other verticals and other merchants within those verticals. Finally, you can expect us to continue to activate the partnerships we've announced, whether that's Shopify, Magento, Visa, or Stripe, and continue to sign partnerships. Our goal is to be connected throughout the entire payments ecosystem and connected to all the major fintech players around the world. We're just getting started. We have a lot of foundations to continue to build upon that will allow us to accelerate growth in the months and years ahead. Very excited the progress we've seen. This is very early days, and I look forward to connecting with you all again next time for another update. Over to questions, Tim.
Thanks, Brad. And lots of questions. Just a reminder, if rather than raise your hand as a participant, it's always good to just type your questions in the Q&A. So the question here, when do you expect the partnerships with Mastercard and Visa to really impact your revenues? And when will the rollouts be completed and available to customers?
We have started work on both of those partnerships, so that will take time for us to integrate. We're not putting a timeline on that. The innovation there will take different angles for each of the different companies. In terms of revenue impact, it really depends on how we activate and executing and introducing new merchants. On the Mastercard side, they're really servicing the medium to larger end of town. So it may take a little bit of time to break down some of those doors with those merchants, but I'm glad that we're working with Mastercard in our corner to open those doors. And when we do, there'll be significant deals which are closed. But I don't want to foreshadow future earnings or future results. So it really is a matter of us being able to execute on that partnership. And that started last week.
Sure. And is there a typical demographic of the user that you've identified?
For the consumer, early 30s and above typically have 2 credit cards or more with an average balance of around sort of 10,000 plus. Digitally savvy, financially literate. We find there's a great affinity when that customer's spending $300 or more. And that's when we start to really come into our own. 3 installments up to 6, we can go up to 12. Merchants, I think if you look to the industries that we're starting to see success, homewares, furniture, appliances, mattresses is a big one for us. Outdoors, bicycles, home fitness equipment. Some really exciting areas there, where there could be snowboards as well as we head into winter. Then luxury retail, accessories, and then interesting things such as dentists and veterinary services. We're seeing a lot of interest and traction with as well. So it's broad, but we're really focused on those 5 areas for now.
Right, and the rollout in Australia, there's quite a few questions around that.
Australia is we're focused on North America, and we're starting to build out our presence now in Europe, just opening an office in the UK. We've been in Australia. It is a market that is heavily penetrated by our friends. We have a lot of work to do to educate where we sit. The team here are making great progress. We just recently launched on Scorp Tech. We have Red's Baby. There's some great interest coming, and I expect to see. We will continue to build out our presence in Australia. It remains strategically important for us to do so. It is highly competitive, and we need to show that we're different from the crowd. So it will take a little longer, but it's a very important market, and we're here to stay.
Right. Well, thank you for your time, Brad. We literally cannot get through all these questions. So we'd like to follow up later on ShareCafe, and we'll be in contact. So thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Next up, we have Kaiser Therapeutics, ASX code KZA, with a market cap of 45 million. The share price has returned a positive 46% over the last 12 months. Kaiser Therapeutics is an oncology-focused biotech company that develops anti-cancer drugs with the main focus on brain cancer. We have with us this afternoon CEO James Garner. Over to you. Thank you, James.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here we go. It's a pleasure to be able to introduce our company here for the first time on ShareCafe. And as Tim has touched on, we are an oncology biotech company. Our primary focus is on brain cancer. And our lead program is relatively well advanced in human trials at this stage. And I'm going to talk a little bit through the detail of it. But I really wanted to start with some of the key points about our company and about our lead program. And our lead drug is called Paxlovid. And this drug was actually originally discovered by a US company called Genentech. And Genentech, for those who aren't familiar, is one of the most successful cancer drug developers in history. It's wholly owned now by Roche. And Genentech completed the early development on this drug. They made a strategic decision that they weren't going to focus on brain cancer. And so as a result of that, we were able to bring the drug into our company, into Casia, and we've been taking it forward since. Now, this matters for investors because in drug development, pedigree counts, and our drug has come from really the very best minds in the industry. It's come from one of the most successful shops in early stage drug discovery. And that's been borne out in some of the clinical data we've been generating in the last year or two with Casia. So we've been conducting a human trial in a particular form of brain cancer called glioblastoma. And I'll say more about that in a moment, but it is the most common and the most aggressive form of brain cancer. And in this disease, our drug has been showing some very positive signals of potential efficacy here. So we're really getting a good read that our drug may well help for these patients. And this is a disease where really nothing else does. So this has been very, very exciting data. And as Tim has mentioned, this has been associated with a progressive revaluation of our company. Now, one of the challenges investors have, though, nevertheless, with all biotech companies is they very often appear to be a binary risk. The drug either works or it doesn't. And we've managed to insulate against some of that downside by also deploying clinical trials in several other forms of brain cancer. And I won't go into a great deal of detail about that today, but we do have 4 human trials ongoing in other forms of brain cancer. And potentially those give us other shots on goal. They give us other opportunities to derive value from the drug. Excuse me, and they protect investors to a certain extent against any potential surprises in our glioblastoma program. So for a small company, we have really quite a rich and diverse program. If we move on to the next slide, I can talk in a little bit more detail about this. You can see here a comparison of brain cancer and specifically glioblastoma with lung cancer, just to pick one other form of cancer for comparison. And in the last 20 years, we've seen more than 20 new drugs approved for lung cancer. And that has really materially changed the outcome for patients with this disease. In brain cancer, the drug that we mainly use is a drug called Temozolomide, which was actually approved in the late 1990s. The other 2 drugs you see there are really for relatively niche specialist uses. So this is a disease where the outlook for patients has not improved since the last century, and that's very much what we're trying to change at Casia. Moving on to the next slide. Just to touch on a few things here about glioblastoma as a disease, and if I can ask perhaps to advance 2 more times. There we go. 1 more, please. Thank you. So glioblastoma, as I mentioned, is the most common and the most aggressive form of brain cancer. It affects about 130,000 patients a year worldwide. It is one of the most aggressive forms of cancer in modern medicine. Without treatment, it's fatal usually within 3 or 4 months. And with best available care, that stretches out to about 12 to 15 months, depending on the exact profile of the patient and the tumor. And as I say, that really hasn't changed in the last several decades. And it compares very poorly to diseases like lung cancer and breast cancer and prostate cancer, where we've made enormous progress in their treatment. And as you can see there at the bottom of the slide, some notable people who've unfortunately passed from this disease. This is a disease that can affect anybody at any point in their life. It's a disease that doesn't have particular risk factors or predispositions. It comes out of the blue. And as I say, it can touch anybody really by surprise. Moving on to the next slide. Shown here how this disease is currently treated, and the typical path for a newly diagnosed patient is that they will have surgery to remove as much of the tumor as possible. They then have radiotherapy, and they then get treated with this drug temozolomide that I mentioned a few moments ago. Now, temozolomide was originally approved by a US company called Merck. It was $1 billion a year in its heyday. It's now off patent, so it sells somewhat less than that. But it does work. It works reasonably well at extending life, but only for 1/3 of patients. And as you can see from the chart in the bottom left, for the remaining 2/3 of patients, temozolomide adds no real clinical benefit. And for those patients, there is no alternative drug available. There is no drug that really has been shown to work. And that's the group for whom we're developing Paxalosib. If I move on to the next slide, our drug is part of a class of drugs called PI3K inhibitors. And this is the sort of terminology that people love in biotech. But the reason why this is relevant for investors is that this is a well understood, well validated, well proven class of medicines. There are 4 FDA approved therapies in the PI3K inhibitor class, and you can see them on the slide here. 3 of them are approved for various kinds of blood cancer, 1 for breast cancer. The unique thing about our drug, the unique thing about Paxalosib, is that it is the only drug in the class that is able to cross the blood-brain barrier. Now, ordinarily, the blood-brain barrier protects the brain from toxins and from damage, but it does make it very, very hard when we're trying to treat disease in the brain. Most of the drugs we have don't get into the brain, they don't cross the blood-brain barrier. And this is a real problem in diseases like multiple sclerosis, Alzheimer's disease, even depression. And it's certainly a problem in brain cancer. Our drug is unique in its ability to get into the brain, and this gives it a unique advantage in terms of treating a disease like brain cancer. Moving on to the next slide. You can see here some of the results we've been starting to see out of the clinical program. And we've looked at 2 measures here. The first is a measure called progression-free survival, and this really measures the ability of a drug to delay growth of the tumor. In other words, to stop the tumor from progressing. And on this, we see in the patients we're targeting, Paxalosib has been associated with a progression-free survival of 8.5 months. That is to say, patients on our drug will take, on average, about 8.5 months for their tumor to grow. Now, with Temozolomide, the existing standard of care drug, that number is 5.3 months. And that difference is really quite material in this. A progression-free survival of 3 or 4 months is really quite an achievement for a drug in a disease like this. More importantly, though, we've also been looking more recently at a measure called overall survival. Now, this is a measure of the ability of a drug to extend a patient's life, which is always the gold standard for any new cancer drug. And on this measure, we see Paxalosib showing an overall survival of 17.7 months, as against 12.7 months for the existing drug, Temozolomide. Now, that's a very, very significant advantage. That's, on the face of it, a 5-month gain in survival, although the comparison is always a little more complex than that. And we have no doubt that if that sort of result was replicated in a larger study, this drug would be eminently eligible for FDA approval and would be a very successful product. Next slide, please. And should it become a successful commercial product, there is a very real market here for the drug to address. Even though brain cancer is much less common than breast cancer or lung cancer, it's still a significant number of patients. Glioblastoma itself represents a market of about $1.5 billion per annum. And as I said at the beginning, there's really not a great deal of competition for that market. So it's really very addressable for a new drug. But beyond that, some of the other human trials that we're running potentially have the opportunity to extend the drug much, much further. We're looking at childhood brain cancer, and we're looking at brain cancers that have spread to the brain from elsewhere in the body. And collectively, this represents at least 10 times as many patients with a commensurate commercial opportunity. And then beyond that, this class of drugs, as I touched on earlier, has been used in other diseases like blood cancers and breast cancer. There's no reason why our drug is any less of a PI3K inhibitor than those. But we've targeted brain cancer initially because that's really our unique advantage, our ability to cross the blood-brain barrier. But in the long term, there's no reason why this could not be a breast cancer drug, a lung cancer drug, or a blood cancer drug. So we see a lot of upside potential for the drug over the course of its life, should we be able to secure an approval in glioblastoma. Next slide, please. I'll just finally touch on some of these other diseases we're looking at here, just very briefly. You see here on the left of the slide our own study ongoing in glioblastoma. We also have a study ongoing in DIPG, which is a childhood brain cancer, very aggressive disease. And then 3 studies, as you can see, in cancer that has spread to the brain from elsewhere in the body. The great thing about this program is that most of these studies are funded by the institutions that are running them. So they are in effect a free carry for CASIA. They're an opportunity for us to collect additional clinical data at very limited cost. For completeness, you'll see that on the right hand of the page, we do have a second asset in our pipeline, Cantrixil, development for ovarian cancer. In the interest of time, I won't really touch on it today, but we do have that also in the pipeline at an earlier stage. Next slide, please, and perhaps next slide. I'll just say a word about our financials. We're an ASX listed company. We do also have a listing on NASDAQ, and about 25% of our stock is held there. We're about a $45 to $50 million market cap at the moment. And we just completed a successful financing round in April and May. We had $7.2 million in an oversubscribed institutional placement. And then that was followed by $1.8 million from existing investors in a share purchase plan. So the company has some cash at the bank to see through at least the next 3 or 4 rounds of data readouts. Next slide, please. And in the interest of time, I'll skip ahead to the next slide. Just to say we have a busy second half ahead of us. We have several more data readouts that are expected, including some first data from some of these studies and other forms of brain cancer. And we think this is going to be an exciting 6 months ahead for the company as we start to see some of these results take shape. Next slide, please. And I'll stop here just to say there's a great deal more information on our website. We're always delighted to receive queries by email as well. So do please feel free to get in touch with us. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Thanks, James. Thank you for your time. I know you've got a bit of a following on the NASDAQ, I've seen. Can I ask, I've got a couple of questions here. How many people get brain cancer a year, and what's the usual price of such drugs?
Yeah, Tim, so with glioblastoma, the number of new cases per year worldwide is about 130,000. In the US, it's probably about 10% of that, about 12,500, 13,000. And Australia really just proportional to population. This isn't a disease that's particularly associated with ethnic groups or different geographical regions. It just hits everybody more or less equally. So it's about 12,500 cases a year in the US. Now, in terms of pricing, the average price at launch for a new cancer drug in the US in 2018 was $148,000 US per year of treatment. Now, of course, not every drug is taken for a year. So if you take the drug for 6 months, then that scales accordingly. But that's the average price for a new cancer drug in the US as of 2018. Which is the most recent data. So new cancer drugs launch at a high price, and there's no reason to believe that the pricing for Paxlovid should be fundamentally different from other new cancer drugs that have come forward. And
one last question, thanks, James. So what are the kind of the next key data points that an investor should focus on when following Kaiser?
Tim, we've got a couple of big things coming up. So we'll be seeing new data from our ongoing study in glioblastoma. This is the one that I just touched on earlier. We've seen some very promising interim data, but the study is not yet complete. So we'll be seeing more mature data and then in due course, final data from that study. We'll certainly be seeing at least one more data readout in the second half of this year. And that'll hopefully help to really confirm and strengthen and provide additional confidence around the data we've been seeing already. What we should also be seeing is some initial data from some of these other studies. So particularly our study in childhood brain cancer and also a study in breast cancer that has spread to the brain. We're hoping to have some initial data readouts from those studies. And I think it's fair to say those studies perhaps haven't been at the center of investors' radar screens yet. And I think hopefully that will be a good surprise if we're able to report something positive out of one or both of those studies.
Great, thanks, James. Thanks for your time on this Friday afternoon, and a truly great story to follow.
Thanks, Tim. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Next up, we have Memphasis, ASX code MEM, with a market cap of 40 million. The stock has had a 1-year return of around 100%. Memphasis is an Australian bioseparations company that develops, manufactures cell separation devices. Its first application is now being commercialised. That application is being used for human IVF treatments, which is a $20 billion global industry. We have with us the CEO, Alison Cootes. Alison, thank you for your time. Over to you.
I've got quite a few slides to get through, so I'll move it along. Thanks, David. The value proposition, we just put these slides out on the ASX this morning. We've got this novel sperm selection technology for improved IVF treatments. There's a large global market, and it looks like it's going to double in the next decade. We've also got some early markets that we're concentrating on for commercial sales, which we feel fairly confident about doing this year, this actual calendar year. These are lower regulatory markets, which I'll talk about, already being assessed in those markets, and the key opinion leaders are pretty fond of the device. We've got collaborations with Monash IVF, leader in the field, plus also Professor John Aitken, who's globally renowned in this area. As I said, first sales we're expecting this year, and we're looking at developing a next generation device that's going to be providing even more opportunities for us, not just in humans, but also in animals. And we're okay in the funding area. Next slide, please. That's a snapshot of us, and you can read that at your level, at your leisure. Next slide, please. All right, so human fertility has been declining, and particularly at an alarming rate since the Second World War. We're not quite sure of it, why it is, but a lot of theories, probably to do with environment, plus also people putting off childbirth later in life, a combination of factors. And it's across the board. There's no one area of the world that's affected more than others. There's a large degree of failure in IVF. So on average, people try about over two times before they get success, but they may not ever be successful. I've known people to go 10 times and not still be successful. There's also some degree of risk of miscarriage and genetic impairment of the offspring with IVF. It's small, but it is certainly more than through the normal ways of becoming pregnant. And interestingly, a lot of people think that infertility is essentially a female thing. It's not. It's split between males and females, and where we're positioned is about separating out the good sperm, and there haven't been any advances in sperm treatment preparation since the advent of IVF about 40 years ago. Next slide, please. Current methods for preparing the semen sample for IVF involve things like centrifuging and putting through various media. They're very, very time consuming, like 30 minutes each. They are also quite damaging, particularly when you centrifuge. And you also have no guarantee that the cells that you are selecting are any good. And some of them actually are DNA damaged, and you can't tell from looking at them. You've got to destroy them to look at the DNA in them, and that's no good. So next slide, please, David. Yeah, so we don't follow on quite, but we've got a device that goes a completely different way of handling the way that you select the sperm cells. With respect to the market, we've got a fairly robust growth in the demand for IVF services, and it's right now it's about 2 million fresh cycles. That's a fresh go at getting pregnant per annum across the world, and it's projected to double, not just in 10 years, but it's actually in kind of like 6 years. lot of that demand is coming from the Asia Pacific area, big markets like Japan, China, India, and all of Asia Pacific. That's the engine of growth. Next slide along, please. So what we've got is a device which is on the right-hand side. It's very easy to work. You'll see it's a console, the finger touching the go button, and a cassette that you put in. That's a thing that you use once and then you discard. So it's a world-first technology. It has a particularly unique way of separating sperm, which I'll talk about in a minute. We think that based on what we have seen to date, that it is possible with this to increase the likelihood of pregnancy, live births, and having a healthy child. It's so easy. It's when you show this to the clinics, they can't believe how easy it is, and they really kind of love it. And we've got some patented IP around it. Next slide, please. The basis of our approach is that we select the sperm based on their net negative charge on the surface. That indicates good cytoskeleton, which indicates good DNA. And that is something that John Aitken brought to us, and he's a leader in the field. So what we do is we have a set of membranes, the mucky lot right in the middle. That's where the sample, the semen, goes. Then we've got a separation membrane, 5 microns, that separates by size. And the good sperm go on along to the anode because they're negatively charged, the anode's positive. It's a very, very quick, efficient and quite gentle process, only lasts 6 minutes. And then at the end, you just pipette out what you've been able to harvest. So it's extremely simple in the way that it operates. It's very clean, very efficient. Next slide, please. Here's a before and after, how a sample looks, just to show it's real. It's very, very nice, nice and clean, the sample afterwards. You know, gets rid of the debris, and most importantly, gets rid of those white blood cells that you really don't want. Next slide. So what we've done is we've engaged with a whole lot of key opinion leaders around the world. As you see, there are 13 of these, and they have a pretty good coverage of the main areas where IVF is in demand. And we haven't just sought any old key opinion leaders. These are guys who are renowned in the field. They publish, they've got very, very reputable, some of the best centres in the world for treating infertility. And we've got a rollout where they're all enrolled in a study to assess our device. We were rolling it out madly, and then COVID hit, and some of the centres have actually been closed for a bit. North America's been hit, Europe's been hit, but Gothenburg still managed to do some, and Tokyo and Shanghai, India and Iran were hit early. So was New Zealand and same Australia, but now they're back on. So India's very slow, but it's coming along. The others are coming back in, and we're getting results up to date right now, and they're all looking very positive, as we expect. Next slide, please, David. So here's me in the middle there with the red shirt, attending the clinic in Tokyo. Fortunately, this is before the lockdown with COVID. One of our people, Vikram, is on my left, and the person who runs the centre, Tomo, is there also, and there was a very, very positive response to us showing how you can treat samples. They gave us a particularly bad one to start with, and they were overjoyed at how well our device went. So they're one of our key sites, and they're also a potentially early market for us. Next slide, please. So the path to market is that we'll be concentrating on trying to get some commercial sales with some of these early markets, and there are 4 of them pointed out here: Japan, India, Canada, New Zealand. We've got key opinion leaders testing the device in all of those markets right now. We've got preliminary results from a number, and it's all looking pretty positive. So what I also want to point out is that the percentage of the global market these cover collectively is about 24%. And the two big ones are Japan and India. We're going to these because they are relatively low regulatory. It's not to say that we're going to give them a bad device, it's nothing like that. But the regulatory hurdles are nowhere near as hard as something like America, where you have FDA, or Europe, we have CE mark, or Australia's got TGA. We're still doing all the right things, but the level of testing is less, and a number of these markets, our device will be considered laboratory equipment, which enables us to get in early. So next market, please, David. The business model, as I said, is to use the console and then put the, sorry, my dog's in the background there. Put the disposable cartridge in it, run it for 6 minutes. It's got the semen sample in there, and then you just pipette the harvest out, and then it's ready to go again. So the business model is to, we would sell at very, very low cost the cartridge, the console, and with the basis of the revenue is an ongoing revenue stream from use of the single-use cartridges. Next one, please. So how are we going? Well, I've done a very, very rough Gantt chart here. And you look down the left, there's, we've manufactured prototypes. Then we're not far from doing full production of the final device. And then there's a regulatory submission on the more higher reg markets. So we've had lots of feedback from Monash along the way, and they're a collaborative partner with us. We've verified that the device works fine. We've got key opinion leader assessments, and that's going along, and it's going to continue. The key opinion leader assessments on the prototypes does not affect us to get the device out. It's going to be ongoing for quite some time. And the prototypes that they're testing are actually going to be identical to the full production. It's just that the full production version is being made in the clean room. So meantime, we've got our plastic injection molder with a certified clean room. They've put it in place, and we're doing final tests on it. Just about to move all the equipment in and do all of the certification that it works according to its plan. We've got the clinical trial design and preparation starting with Monash IVF, and that's going to be full steam ahead very shortly. We're building the final quality consoles as soon as the equipment's moved into the clean room. Also, sorry, not the cartridges, the consoles are made elsewhere in Melbourne. They don't need a clean room. Monash IVF is doing an evaluation of the final device, and we've got to do various final verification and validation testing. Then once all that's done, we will be ready to sell in early markets. And as I said, that should be by Q4 this year. And we also are planning doing the clinical trials with Monash IVF for the Australian regulatory approval. And we'll submit that later, and we'll simultaneously start to be preparing our applications in other high reg markets such as North America and Europe. Next slide, please. So the strategic focus has been human-assisted reproductive technologies, ART. Our key device is Felix. I'm launching it into the human IVF market. But we're also starting to move into animal ART, and there's room for doing the same sort of thing, but for artificial insemination, horses, cows, pigs, sheep, you name it. And that's where we're going. We've used equine as a model for getting the next generation device designed. We're just starting to do that now. We've got some really interesting ideas about fluid flow, fluid dynamics, and really, really novel. And why are we doing this? Because livestock they generally have much higher volumes of semen, much higher density of sperm in the semen, and the little Felix is just not going to be big enough to handle it. But interestingly, if we can crack this, and I think we will, then it will have application to human as well, and it will open up new markets for us, such as intrauterine insertion, effectively AI for humans. Our current device sometimes gets enough sperm for IUI in humans, but not always. This next lot will effectively open that market up, which could potentially double the available market to us in humans. And by the way, horses are also a very interesting market in their own right, even though they can't have AI in thoroughbreds. There's enough in performance horses to make this an interesting market. And particularly if you can work with fresh rather than frozen semen. So the investment highlights is that we've got a novel sperm selection technology for improved IVF outcomes. It's for male infertility, which happens about 50% of the time for an infertile couple. It's not all about the female. We've got an international commercial rollout from Q4 onwards. And so far the response from the key opinion leaders has been exceedingly positive. It's a massive global market and still growing like mad. It's in the devices in the hands of leading key opinion leader clinics who are the initial likely purchasers. As I said, they're very positive about it. We're collaborating with excellent partners, including Monash IVF and Professor John Aitken at University of Newcastle. And we're developing the next generation device for use in animals and expanded human applications. So over to questions.
Thank you, Alison. We've got quite a few questions, which I might get you to answer offline. We've got one particular question. We've just got time for a short answer, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So how are your key opinion leaders who are commercially testing the device, how are they going to drive sales?
How are they going to drive sales? Well, they're going to seed the markets. Most of them are in pretty large clinics anyway, and that have reasonable volumes. I mean, if we got the clinic in Shanghai to take up our device, I mean, they do more in a couple of weeks than we do in Australia in a year. So, and the Japanese clinic's got 2 sites, for instance, one in Kobe, one in Tokyo. These are major clinics. But more importantly, if they like this and they will be behind it, these are kind of academically strong people who publish papers and talk at conferences, and they, in a sense, they will endorse it. And these are the leaders that other people follow. So that's, we seed the markets with these key opinion leaders, and then we follow on along and go to other clinics in that particular market.
Great, thanks, Alison. We've got quite a few questions, as I said, offline, so we'll come back to those and we'll send those through to you. Next up, we have Antisense with the ASX code of ANP. It's got a market cap of $33 million. It's got a 1-year return of a positive 42%. Antisense, who is Antisense? It's a biotechnology company developing and commercializing antisense pharmaceuticals for some large unmet markets in rare diseases, such as muscular dystrophy and multiple sclerosis. We have with us today the CEO, Mark Diamond. Mark, thank you for your time.
Oh, thanks very much, Tim, and thank you to the ShareCafe team for the opportunity to present on Antisense Therapeutics today. As Tim highlighted, we have market capitalisation of 32 million. That equates to an enterprise value of around 27 million, based on the cash that we reported at the 31st of March this year. Top 40 holders own effectively half of the company. That includes the 2 substantial shareholders, it being the renowned institutional investors, Australian Ethical and Platinum Asset Management. Next slide, thanks. So the company, as the name suggests, is focused on developing and commercialising our antisense therapeutics that we are developing for diseases where there is an acknowledged need for better therapies. We have 2 antisense drugs. We call them AT1102 and AT1103. Both these compounds have been through multiple successful phase 2 clinical trials. So by any comparison locally, we have an advanced staged clinical pipeline. Today, I'm going to concentrate on our program for Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, where we recently reported highly promising results from a phase 2 clinical trial. Just say that our drug AT1103, which is being developed for a rare growth disorder called acromegaly, that drug is positioned to move into registration studies, and we'll be looking to do that with a pharmaceutical partner. But today we'll focus on our work in Duchenne's. Next slide, thanks. Antisense therapeutics, what is it? What are they? They are, firstly, what we call a platform technology. That is that you can use the same basic chemistry to design multiple antisense drugs for a very broad range of diseases. But simply described, they are modified pieces of DNA, and they are designed to block specific disease-causing proteins. And we have acquired our antisense drugs from the biggest player in the space, a company called Ionis Pharmaceuticals, who are a US-based, NASDAQ-listed company, market capitalization approaching 10 billion. And we have worldwide exclusive licenses from Ionis for all disease applications for this drug. So again, we have an unusual arrangement where we've actually acquired from the big pharmaceutical company, rights to a program that we believe have got huge commercial potential. Next slide, thank you. Duchenne's muscular dystrophy is a devastating muscle wasting disease of boys, and it's caused by a faulty gene in the boys which prevents them from making a key protein for muscle function. So in the Duchenne's boys who aren't making enough of this protein called dystrophin, they lose the strength and function in the largest muscles of the bodies first, which is the muscles of the lower limbs. So usually by the age of around 10 to 12, they end up being confined to a wheelchair. And unfortunately, the disease is 100% fatal. So all boys will have progressive muscle wasting of all muscles in their body, and will succumb either to respiratory or cardiac failure, a long-living Duchenne's boy, lucky to get into his 30s. It is a rare disease, orphan disease, but it does affect a surprisingly large number. It's about 44,000 boys in the US and EU that have the disease. So it's actually the most common fatal genetic disorder. One of the key challenges with these boys is that the loss of dystrophin in the muscles causes inflammation in the muscles. And it's that inflammation in the muscles that exacerbates the muscle wasting, leading to the loss of strength and function. So today, the only way of dealing with that inflammation is to use the high doses of a drug category called corticosteroids. And you may know them as drugs like prednisolone, which are used in diseases like asthma. But when they're used chronically in these boys with Duchenne's, which they need to be, basically once the boys go onto it, they're on the therapy for life, they have some very significant side effects, including significant weight gain, osteoporosis, and growth retardation. So, they are unfortunately a necessary evil in these boys, because if the boys aren't on the corticosteroids, that progressive muscle loss and wastage will occur even more rapidly. So we're looking at a way of treating the inflammation superior to the way in which it's treated today with the corticosteroids. Next slide, thanks. So our antisense drug, it's targeting a protein that we know to be very important in the inflammatory processes in these boys with Duchenne's. What we also know is that the corticosteroid drugs have no effect on this particular protein. So don't affect the amount of the protein or the cells that carry this protein. So we are working on a drug which is working through a completely novel mechanism to the way the corticosteroids are working, which allows us to be able to use our drugs in combination with the corticosteroids. Importantly, or notably, we're the only company in the world that has a drug targeting CD49D in development for Duchenne's. Next slide. So we've just recently completed our phase 2 clinical trial that we ran at the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne, which is has the biggest clinic in the Southern Hemisphere for treating boys with Duchenne's. We tested the drug for 6 months in 9 non-ambulant boys. So these are boys that are more advanced with their Duchenne's. Very excitingly for us, we were able to say that the study met its primary endpoint and showing that the drug was well tolerated in the boys with Duchenne's. We had no serious adverse events and no boys withdraw from the study. But also, very, very encouragingly, we were able to show in these boys that we were able to stabilise and in fact improve on the disease progression processes in these boys. So we reported stabilisation in the strength of their upper limbs and also in the function of their limbs compared to the known or expected losses that would come in these boys even when they're on their high doses of steroids. And in fact, we added our AT1102 on top of the existing doses of the steroids that these boys were receiving. To complement that, in the study, we're also able to show, along with these physical improvements in the boys, that we actually were observing important changes in the muscle structure. And so we see here on the slide, in our in interactions with the key opinion leaders in the area of Duchenne's, drew a lot of encouragement from their perspective that us being able to show a benefit across these multiple parameters puts us in a very exciting position for the continued development of this drug. Next slide, thanks. So next study that we're contemplating is what we'd call a phase 2B trial. We've been talking to the European regulatory authorities about doing a longer study and at higher doses. What's very exciting that's emerged from those discussions is that the regulators have told us that if we run a study for that duration and looking at changes of the type that we were already demonstrating in this phase 2 clinical trial that we ran locally, that we could expect that as the basis of an early approval in Europe. So effectively, one study away from being able to market our drug in the second biggest pharmaceutical market in the world. Next slide. This slide just outlines the news flow and catalysts that we are anticipating in the short to medium term around our programs, in particular the work that we're doing in Duchenne's. We are very advanced in discussions with the US regulatory people and key opinion leaders in that market. We're also have now intentions to submit for orphan drug designation in both the US and Europe, which would add additional IP protection and regulatory incentives, which would expedite, we believe, the approval of those drugs, this drug rather, in those markets. Next slide. So when you're contemplating the market potential of AT1102, we've got to recognise that the drug has a very broad-based effect on inflammatory processes. So we, as highlighted, focusing presently on the drug in Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. That market is expected to reach over $4 billion within the next 2 to 3 years, and recognizing that today the only therapy that's available for the boys that are non-ambulant with their Duchenne's are the corticosteroid drugs, which were approved first time 60 years ago. So we think we're sitting in a very exciting position with our first sort of entry into the market in Duchenne's. But when you look at the corticosteroid market, it's valued nearly $20 billion, and then even more directly at the anti-inflammatory market, where you've got some of the newer, higher-priced therapeutics, with that market valued over $100 billion. We think this drug presents with some very exciting commercial potential. Next slide. So, sort of summarising the value drivers for the company. Firstly, important to say we're expecting lots of news flow and important catalysts in the short to medium term. We have, as described earlier, a very advanced clinical pipeline with trial results that have been published in peer-reviewed scientific journals. With our work in Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, having only very recently reported on our trial results, I think we've got a program which is looking like, when you compare it to any other drugs that are being contemplated in that space, we think we've got a drug that really stands above all other drugs that are currently being contemplated for the non-ambulant boys with Duchenne's. But beyond Duchenne's, as I said, we think we've got multiple applications for the drug. We're looking forward to report on our advances of this drug into those new disease indications, adding further value to the program. So, Tim, thanks. Happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Mark. Such important work against such a dreadful disease. So what are the sort of real life benefits you see in these boys?
Yeah, so Tim, with the boys that are non-ambulant, what we've been measuring is their upper limb function and strength. And so, in fact, we've spent a lot of time with the advocacy groups who are representing the parents and the patients with Duchenne's. And what we've come to learn on is that some of the basic things that we all take for granted in terms of functionality, like using your hands to eat with, to be able to use a mouse, keyboard, these are a functionality that these boys lose very rapidly if they're not under treatment. And so just by being able to stabilize the boys for an extended period so that they can do those sort of basic daily activities is a huge benefit outcome. And that's what we're hoping that we can deliver here with this program.
And why the focus on Europe and not the States?
Sorry. Oh, sure. So the reason for going to Europe is that we have the opportunity there to be able to go straight from this proof of concept study into what's potentially a pivotal or registration study. So it's just that accelerated approval opportunity that's had us go to that market initially. But we are, as highlighted, in the process of engaging with the US FDA for potential accelerated development path in the US as well too.
And that phase 2B next stage, what's that mean in terms of how many patients, how long does it take, what's it cost?
Sure. So the number of patients, we are anticipating around 75 patients. So for a study that could lead to an approval, that is a relatively small trial, and it reflects the fact that we're developing the drug for a rare disease, but also one where there's no therapies currently available for these patients. So we're thinking 25 patients would be on a placebo, and then we would also have 2 dosing arms. Both of those would have 25 patients. So we'd be looking to dose those patients for a year, and then looking at the improvements around the upper limb strength and function, like what we reported previously in this current study. In terms of timelines, we are now, we think, only a very short time away from receiving specific feedback from the European Medicines Agency on the study design, Tim. So that's due mid-year, but could come through, before the end of the month. And so once we've got that feedback from the EMEA, we'll be a little bit more specific about the timing of the study.
Great, Mark. And just finally, we've had a number of questions. So do you have any competitors close behind you?
So in the area that we're developing, which is for the boys with that are non-ambulant, very few. There's I know of only one other study currently, running where they've been testing drugs for the non-ambulant boys. So there's nothing that's close to an approval, and as I said earlier, nothing that's looking like it's having the same therapeutic benefits that we're showing, albeit in early studies than what we've demonstrated. But important to note, Tim, though, is that because we've got this novel mechanism with our drug, we think even should that competition emerge, we're anticipating our drug could be used in combination with those other therapies, because when we speak to all the specialists, their view is that these boys are likely to be on multiple therapies to slow this steady decline into loss of strength and function in all the muscles. So the notion is that these drugs are going to be more likely used as complementary therapies than become competitive.
Great, thanks, Mark. Thank you for your time. We'll wrap it up now. So next week, firstly, I'll just wrap up and say that we've had some fantastic Australian stories present today in regards of companies making real differences in people's lives. So next week, change of pace again, we're talking gold, and we're talking gold with some of the big boys. So we've got Resolute, Regis and Ramulus, all billion-dollar Australian gold companies lined up to present, so stay tuned for that. All these webinars, we will produce them, they've all been recorded. We'll have copies of all the individual webinars on ShareCafe next week. Thank you for your time, and have a good weekend.